Good evening. I'd like to start today's show talking about some of the advances that Ukraine has made in the last few days. There have been reports of some advances made in the area south of Bahkmut and Klescheyevska. Klescheyevka is on the southern flank of Bahkmut, and reports are that Russian forces have been pushed back in these areas after very heavy attacks from the Ukrainians. Now, the Bahkmut area has been under heavy conflict since October of 2022, and during that time there was a slow grinding push by the Russians, pushing the Ukrainians back out of the Bahkmut area. Now, Bahkmut has become one of those towns which have hold a significance in this conflict. One of the largest battles raged there, and heaviest fighting through urban areas. So there is a morale and PR boost to Ukraine to be able to claim success in this area. However, the gains in territory in Klescheyevka have come at a terribly high cost. Even Ukrainian reports in the media this week reporting that for every 100 meters they gain, they lose 4 or 5 men. Now, based upon the reporting that I've seen in a number of areas, I would unfortunately suggest that that could be rephrased to for every 10 meters it's 4 or 5 men, or something more along those lines. So yes, the Ukrainians have made an advance in this area, have gained some territory, and have pushed the Russians back. They've assumed an area of the heights on the flanks of Klescheyevka. However, one must question what the cost has been, and ultimately, when this is over, will people look back and believe the cost was justified? The Ukrainians have also had some success in the last day over Crimea. There have been waves of drones launched from Odessa into Crimea, and from the Kherson region into Crimea. The Russian Ministry of Defense is reporting that they shot down in one grouping yesterday 48 drones. However, a number of Storm Shadow missiles were able to get through Russian air defense. I think perhaps 3 of them got through. And over the last 3 or 4 days, we've had confirmation of 3 Russian ammunition dumps being targeted in Crimea, and also reports that a repair facility has been struck. So the Ukrainians have had some successes in the last couple of days in Crimea, taking out these 3 Russian ammunition dumps. Now, these ammunition dumps in Crimea will be very important to the Russians. They will be there to support, the push up into the Kherson region, and possibly a push to Odessa now that the grain deal has completed. We can see that Odessa is now looking more and more likely that it will become land that Russia will look to occupy. In terms of other positive notes for the Ukrainians in the last day or so, in Snigirevka, which is an area about 50 kilometers northeast of Kherson city, the head of the Russian admin in that area reports that Ukrainian forces appear to be preparing to storm the Dneiper river. No more detail was given in what I was able to find there as to when he was expecting that to occur, or exactly where he was expecting that to occur. Interestingly, a related note, I saw some video of the Novakhovka reservoir, which was drained a month or so ago after the dam wall was destroyed, and farmers have now moved down onto the floodplains, what would have been the base of the reservoir area. They've moved down there and are planting potatoes and using that area now to grow potatoes. So at least some perhaps some good has come for those people remaining in that area of Ukraine to be able to use that soil to generate some produce. However, I must say that is about all of the good news for the Ukrainians in the last 48 hours. We are seeing the use of cluster munitions in Ukraine by the Ukrainians, and while some of the Ukrainian social media supporters of Ukraine are cheering this on, I think anyone really recognises that the use of cluster munitions is not a good idea for Ukraine. But another thing to consider here is that the increased use of these cluster munitions indicates a decline in the availability of the high explosive 155mm shells that in many cases it could be assumed the Ukrainians would be preferring to be able to use these high explosive shells rather than the cluster munitions. The cluster munitions do have some uses, but by all accounts they are not as useful as high explosive armor-piercing rounds, particularly when you're trying to destroy tanks, armoured vehicles, and that sort of thing. The much less powerful cluster munitions, while they work well if you have a large field of unprotected infantry, if that's not the case, then they aren't as effective. So the increased use of them is, I would suggest, an indication of a lack of 155mm shells reaching the front lines for the Ukrainians. As I reported earlier in the week, in a recent aid package from Germany, and assuming this hasn't been proven to be a typo, they announced that Germany were providing 1,035 155mm rounds to Ukraine. At current rates of fire, that's a couple of hours worth of shells for Ukraine. So there's certainly a supply shortage there. Weeb Union, who is an online commentator, does some great commentary on YouTube, has done an assessment of the video footage available since the start of June, since the start of the offensive, and has used that to compile a visually confirmed list of a minimum number of Leopard tanks that have been destroyed, or at least severely damaged. His analysis gave him a total of 29 visually confirmed. Now, that would be logically a minimum number, as there are likely to be other Leopards where there isn't visual video confirmation of them. So we wouldn't have them included in that total. While it is possible that some of those Leopards have perhaps been damaged twice in the last 6 weeks. They were perhaps damaged once, taken back, repaired and brought back. I guess that is possible. But I would suggest it's still probably a minimum. Now, that 29 is of a reported total of 81 Leopards that were given to Ukraine. So after 7 weeks of fighting and with a lull in the middle where there was reduced usage of the Leopard tanks. If you remember, at the first few days, there were heavy losses in the minefields in the Orhov region, and then just to the east of there. So there was a change in tactics by the Ukrainians where they resorted to using infantry carrying vehicles to rush infantry up towards the Russian positions and then drive back out, and they weren't leading with these Leopards. So given that there was a gap there in the middle, to see 29 of them, which is over a third of them, destroyed in 7 weeks, it just is a testament to how heavy and strong the fighting is, and perhaps how the nature of battle has changed with the use of drones in this conflict to be able to take out armour relatively cheaply. I mean, these tanks are multi-million-dollar pieces of equipment. These drones, these Lancet drones that are taking them out, are far, far less expensive than that. There was an interview published televised interview with Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, and Vladimir Putin, president of Russia. And in there, they discussed that just recent battle near Robotino. They suggested that 15 Leopards and 20 Bradleys were destroyed in that. This is in recent days when we have seen a resumption of the use of these heavy pieces of armored vehicles to be used in the Ukrainian attacks. A couple of interesting things that were discussed in that meeting with Lukashenko and Putin. Lukashenko mentioned that the Wagner forces who are being stationed in Belarus have been talking to him, and they are getting restless, they're getting bored, and they have been asking for permission to go to Poland. In the video, I mean, I suppose you've got to try and find moments of lightness or humour in this conflict, but there was a surprise sort of wry smile on Putin's face when Lukashenko mentioned this. And I must admit, it did sound funny that the way he referred to them as getting bored and wanting to go for an excursion to Poland, and they were reassuring him that it'd be okay, they had it all under control. Anyhow, clearly the Wagner forces in Belarus are stirring up some attention. Poland has, the videos come out of Poland of like 200 more vehicles heading towards the border, the Lithuanian border and the border with Belarus. Poland has announced plans for a battle group, and that battle group is going to be positioned on the northern border of Poland along the Suwalki Gap. So the Suwalki Gap is that 65-odd kilometre border of land between Poland and Lithuania in the north, but which is bookended on each end on the west by Kaliningrad, the oblast of Russia, which is separated from the mainland, but which has access to the Baltic Sea, and bookended on the eastern side by the western edge of Belarus. So this Polish battle group is being sent up there to secure that corridor. As you can imagine, in the scale of things, Belarus, which is operating in concert with Russia and will support Russia, and Russia will support Belarus in any attacks on each other's land, 65-kilometre gap to Kaliningrad from Belarus is a very small distance. In the scheme of things, if Russia and Belarus were able to put forces in there and open a corridor, not only would that then connect Kaliningrad to Belarus and Russia, it would enable a land transit for Russia to the Baltic. So they would have direct access to Kaliningrad and through to the Baltic Sea, which would become very useful for them, given what's happening in the Black Sea at the moment, where it's possible that NATO forces could get involved in there, or perhaps Turkish forces, although unlikely, could get involved in there and begin to restrict the Black Sea Fleet's movements in that area. If Russia had access to the Baltic Fleet, that opens up another opportunity for them to export and import goods. But not only that, if that corridor were to be secured by the Russians, then you would find that Lithuania is now isolated. It can no longer travel down through down through into Poland. They would now be, they would effectively be locked to having to travel north or having to travel via the Baltic. So definitely, I think the Suwalki Gap is definitely an area to watch. Lukashenko also spoke about with Putin about the fact that the Belarusians would not accept Poland annexing the western oblasts of Ukraine. Now, this is something that I've spoken about recently and has been hinted at a number of times, that if the Ukrainians allow Polish and Lithuanian forces into Ukraine, into the west of Ukraine, to provide support or even to protect the western oblasts, that should Ukraine be weakened enough, that the Ukrainians may find those Polish forces suddenly become an occupying force, and that Poland may wish to claim back that land which it lost in 1939, when the Soviet Union and the Nazis claimed Poland, the area to the east which the Soviet Union annexed. They kept, and that became Belarus and Russia, modern day Belarus and Russia, and Ukraine. And I'm sure there are members of Poland who would love to be able to get some of that land back, if possible. So while this is a problem for Ukraine, if they were to accept those forces in and then find they became occupying forces, it's also a problem for Belarus. And geographically, given the shape of things here, Belarus is boxed in on its western and southwestern flanks by Poland. If Poland moved further and took area in Ukraine, then it would become very easy for Poland, if it wanted to begin to nibble off the southwestern corner of Belarus. So some of the other things that they mentioned were that they believe, this is the interview with Lukashenko and Putin, they believe that the number of Ukrainians killed in action in the offensive since June is more than 26,000. That's a huge number, a terrible number. 26,000 in what's probably getting close to 60 days, maybe 70 days of fighting now. 60 days, I guess, of fighting. That's 500 men a day killed in action. If those numbers are correct, now I have no way of confirming if they are correct. Simplicius the thinker, in another one of his amazing articles, references something which I saw today on a Telegram, which is an alleged leak from a Ukrainian site, which is reporting that there are 310,000 killed Ukrainians in the conflict in total. Simplicius, the thinker, refers to wartears.org, who, by using different metrics and measuring data and counting public deaths and all that sort of thing, gathering the information they can, try to make an estimate of what those numbers might be. Their estimate comes out to be 240,000 killed in action. I did a video a few weeks ago where I did my own sort of rough numbers around some of that, and yeah, these numbers seem feasible. While not something that you would hope would be possible or true, there is data to indicate this. There are images now of Ukrainian cemeteries overflowing. There are reports of people in Ukraine just claiming that the number of people that they personally know that have been killed or severely injured in Ukraine are staggeringly high. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, this study that was done by the Kiev Institute of Statistics, so a Ukrainian body doing it, was suggesting that something like 80% of Ukrainians surveyed knew, I think on average, 7 people who had been killed or wounded, and it was a huge number. So I tend to believe, combined with all of the footage which for the last year we've been seeing, just constant day in, day out footage of both dead Russians and dead Ukrainians, but talking about the Ukrainians here, these sort of numbers are horrible if they are true, and even if they aren't true. And you might just say, look, yep, those numbers have come from Russia and they're overinflated. Great, let's hope they are. And even if they are, if they're overinflated by 100,000, that's still a massive number. That's still somewhere between 140 and 200,000 killed in action. It's just terrible. There are reports coming out now where Ukraine and other European nations are recognising that Ukraine has another problem on its hand. Not only has it lost all of its men of the age group from 18 to 50, or losing large numbers of them, but they've lost so many of their women in refugees leaving Ukraine. Now, if those women don't return after the conflict, and if they don't have men there to return to, then Ukraine just won't be able to reproduce. It will just struggle to grow again. The Ukraine will never be as we have seen it before. It will definitely change in large and dramatic ways in the coming year or so. So there's all of that going on, and then if I start to look to provide a bit of an update on the Russian offensive. So the strikes, the grain deal is dead. The strikes on the Odessa ports have continued after about 5 straight days of missile and drone attacks on the main Odessa ports and the Nikolaev ports and surrounding airfields. Now, these attacks have occurred here because these airfields have been used to launch drone attacks, well, allegedly been used to launch drone attacks on Crimea. And there are reports that while the grain deal was in place, that the Ukrainians felt safe that the ports of Odessa wouldn't be struck. And this bears out historically. There were very few attacks on Odessa while the grain deal was in operation. What this meant was that the Ukrainians effectively had a safe haven for storing ammunition, storing equipment, perhaps even storing men, preparing men, but certainly for storing heavy equipment, products, oil, these sort of fuel, ammunition. All of this could safely be stored under what you might call a grain shield. While the grain deal was in operation, the Ukrainians were sure that the Russians wouldn't attack the ports, wouldn't attack the supplies and the stockpiles there. And so these are ports by nature. They have large, massive storage facilities, and these areas could be used to hide weapons and machinery. There have also been a number of reports of one of the reasons that the Russians were unhappy with the grain deal was that they believed that tankers were being used to transport into Ukraine weapons via tankers, and this was one of the reasons they wanted to stop the deal. So while I can't corroborate that, there certainly are a growing number of reports indicating that that was likely to have been occurring. When I think about it, seems like a fairly logical thing to do. If I was a nation at war and suffering under restrictions, if I found a way to be another pathway to move weapons and supplies into my country, I'd certainly do it. And all the better if I could do it into a port which I felt had protection from the enemy at that period of time. So with the grain deal over, the strikes on Odessa have continued nightly for the last 5 or 6 nights. Last night, there was an escalation which I think really demonstrates Russia's position on this grain deal. So to the far west of Odessa, on the Danube River, the Danube forms the border with Romania. And last night, 2 ports there, the Reni and the Ismail seaport, both were attacked. There's video footage now showing the damage done to the Reni port, and it's significant damage. It has taken out the grain silos there. It appears to have also taken out some ships, and it is within spitting distance of Romania. So this attack by the Russians, while very, very risky, it's a very confident attack, and it shows that Russia are very serious about the grain deal and that the supply of grain will stop to Ukraine. It also demonstrates the accuracy of their long-range weapons in that these strikes occurred in the ports and literally a number of meters away in the middle of the river is where the Romanian border starts. So the Russians were confident enough in their missile capabilities and drone capabilities to be able to enact these attacks on the far west of Odessa and be confident that they wouldn't land them in Romania, and they seem to have successfully achieved that. This will also send a message to the shipping community that Russia can reach any of the ports and that you would be unwise to send your ships there. So I expect that we will see the current backlog of ships which were hovering around the mouth of the Danube to head up to these ports. They'd moved away from from Nikolaev and the main Odessa ports. All the boats had cleared out of there. They were all clogging up the river to unload up there. I imagine that we will see in the next few days many of those ships turn around and leave the Black Sea, as they will realise that they will no longer gain insurance to be able to deal with Ukraine. One of the things that I saw today too, which is interesting, I thought, these are the 7 points that have been presented to Ukraine by Russia in order for the Russians to restart the grain deal. So I'll just read through them. There's only 7. The Russians require a real, not a speculative, conclusion from the sanctions on the supply of Russian grain and fertilizers to world markets. This is one of the things they've mentioned, where they have been unable, while the grain deal has been going on, to provide their grain and fertilizer to any nations, developing nations, developed nations, due to the sanctions the West have put on them. Number 2, all obstacles for Russian banks and financial institutions that serve the supply of food and fertilizers must be removed. Number 3, deliveries to Russia of spare parts and components for agricultural machinery and the fertilizer industry should be resumed. 4, all issues with the charter of ships and insurance of Russian export food supplies must be resolved. All logistics of food supplies must be provided. Number 5, unhindered conditions must be provided for expanding the supply of Russian fertilizers and raw materials for their production, including the restoration of the operation of the Togliatti-Odessa ammonia pipeline. The Togliatti-Odessa ammonia pipeline is one that runs from Togliatti in Russia. It's up to the northeast of Moscow. It's deep in Russia. It runs down into Ukraine through the Kharkiv region and then down to the port in Odessa. It was destroyed, or it was damaged, and it may rendered inoperable maybe a month ago in the Kharkiv region. So, and some sort of explosive attack was made on it and stopped that pipeline from being able to ship ammonia or fertilizer to the Odessa port. Number 6, Russian assets related to the agricultural industry should be unlocked. Number 7, there must be a restoration of the original humanitarian nature of the grain deal. It should work for countries in need, not make rich countries richer. So what Russia is referring to here is that the bulk recipients of Ukrainian grain, the largest recipients of Ukrainian grain, are European nations, not developing nations. And so this is what they're talking at here. What Russia is effectively saying is that if there's going to be a grain corridor, and if, as the West is now claiming, that this grain is required to feed the starving nations of the world and the developing nations, then that is what the grain corridor and the grain deal needs to provide. And it is not a grain corridor to allow grain to be shipped out of Ukraine and then back up to European nations, which is what appears to be happening. There is also there is a possibility that grain could leave Ukraine via rail. However, a lot of it, which will be down in Odessa, which will have been down there to be ready to be transported via ship, would now need to be transported by rail from Odessa. It can be done that way, but it goes over the Zatoka Bridge. Now, the Zatoka Bridge, this Sunday, there were reports that attacks were being made on it by Russia. If that bridge was taken out, then effectively any grain in Odessa would be staying in Odessa. It'll be very, very difficult to ship it out. I couldn't actually find confirmation if the Zatoka Bridge had been destroyed, but we can see that from the attacks on the Reni port on the far west of Odessa, that the Russians, if they wanted to, would be able to disable this bridge. So that means this grain is going to be stuck there. It's not going to travel to Europe. And that may be part of the reason why the West is so unhappy about this grain deal really being closed, is that they're not going to get access to that Ukrainian deal, Ukrainian grain, which means they will now need to purchase grain on the global market from other suppliers, and the world's largest supplier is Russia. And so Russia will then effectively benefit from this by having to sell its grain and be able to sell it ultimately to European nations is where it would end up going. Very complex web. Once in a world like ours, which is so globally interconnected, when you try to stop dealing with one entity, it becomes difficult. Some other things just on that topic: the oil barrel cap, which the West enacted in about December of last year. That will put a $60 US dollar per barrel price on oil. The Russian oil is now exceeding that cap. So on markets, they're selling it higher than that. So that hasn't worked. And also the discount that Russians were putting on their oil is decreasing. So it seems as though the world market is happily purchasing Russian oil at this stage, and that attempt to stop that hasn't worked. It's long been known that much Russian oil has been purchased by, say, the likes of India. India have then gone and mixed it with a bit of Saudi oil, and it's no longer considered to be Russian oil then, and can be safely sold back into Europe at that stage. So in some respects, the sanctions were never going to really work. Other activity today in Ukraine, air raid alarms and air defense activity in areas surrounding Kiev. So in the north, there have been reports of missile and drone attacks today. In the Sumy region, Sumy is about 300 kilometers east of Kiev. The Cherkasy region, which is about 150 kilometers south of Kiev. Chernigov, which is about 100 kilometers to the north, and Poltava, which is about 300 kilometers southeast. So really in a half semicircle from the northeast of Kiev, around the northeast of Kiev, coming down to the south of Kiev, there were strikes today. Chernigov and Sumy are two areas which have been undergoing more frequent bombing and missile and drone attacks over the last few months, starting back in May. Certainly seems as though they are being prepared for some sort of an advance. Other activity now in Avdiivka. So this is in the Donetsk area. Avdiivka is just to the southwest of Donetsk city. It has been a thorn in Donetsk's side since 2014, as allegedly Avdiivka has been the position from which the Ukrainians have been shelling the Donetsk city. So this is an area in which the Ukrainians are very dug in. They're well reinforced in there, and an area which the Russians and the DPR would very much like to move them out of. Now, what is happening there at the moment is that the Russians appear to be enacting another, or what they call a cauldron, or an encirclement or a pincer type movement, where Avdiivka is rapidly finding itself being surrounded on three sides by solid Russian positions, and the Russians are establishing fire control over the remaining roads into Avdiivka, and that it is quite possible that the Russians will either, as they did in Bahkmut or Artyomovsk, as it's now called by the Russians, they will either squeeze this corridor, leaving it open just enough for reinforcements to get in, and continue then to attrit the Ukrainian forces in Avdiivka, or they may move to complete the encirclement and then attack from all sides, with the remaining forces forced then to either attempt to escape, or surrender, or fight until the very end in Avdiivka. So this is an area which I would keep an eye on over the next few coming days and weeks, just to see what decision the Russians make around there. Moving a little north of Donetsk area, in Crimea. So there is a large forested area there which battling has been going on for some time. Now the Russians are starting to advance to the west, just north of the forested area. And then 35 kilometers north of that, a new bridgehead has been established at Kovalivka. And here the Russians are looking to push to the Oskil River. So in this northern region, the Russians are definitely making a push and having some success developing bridgeheads. If we go from Kovalivka, if you go 45 kilometers north of there to up to Kupiansk, just north of Kupiansk, the Russians are almost on the Oskil River. If at Kovalivka they can make it to the Oskil River, that then becomes on the Russians' western flank a natural border of the river. And they've effectively then got Kupiansk in the north, and Kovalivka in the middle, and then Crimea at the bottom. In Kovalivka, they can hit the Oskil and then split their forces and start to drive north and join up with those in Kupiansk, and drive south and meet up with those in Crimea in the forested area. It almost seems these are tactical advances, not, I don't think, strategically long planned ones. These are just where a breakthrough has been achieved, and they have been able to establish some form of a rout of the forces, the Ukrainian forces in that area. They've lost one position, they've been able to chase them back out. The advances in this area have been quite rapid, in the scale of sort of 5 to 7 kilometers in a few days. There's even talks around the Kovalivka area that perhaps they've gone as far as 10 kilometers out from where they were just a week ago. So I think the Russians will probably look to establish a bit of a bridgehead, and they'll be gauging it day by day. If they feel they have got the Ukrainians rolling on the run, they may proceed, as long as they have enough reinforcements themselves to strengthen themselves and secure the bridgehead. If they get to the Oskil, then as I say, they'll probably split and roll north and south down the river at that stage. But those advances around Klescheyevska that we talked about earlier for the Ukrainians have been balanced by these advances by the Russians. Many people are saying that the Ukrainian offensive has thus far become the Russian offensive, because I think on a net scenario, perhaps more land has been taken by or almost more land taken by the Russians than the Ukrainians. And remember that the Ukrainians still are yet to actually make it as far as the Russian fortified defensive lines in the Zaporozhye and Donetsk areas. So the Russians still have their main lines of defense yet to be reached, let alone breached by the Ukrainians. So just a couple of things here to finish off with. This was interesting, I thought, today. It's slightly off the topic, but not really. The Ministry of Sport in Russia has recognized laser tag and drone racing as registered sports. And well, it sounds funny when you think about it. This indicates Russia is really going onto a war footing. The outcome of this is likely to be, in a year's time, perhaps as short as that Russia may have, given that there's 140 million people here in this country, that Russia may have 10 million people who are competitively trained drone pilots, and 1 million people who have experience in breaching urban areas and fortifications, working with basic military tactics in small groups from playing laser tag. So that's what the goal will be here. The Russian Ministry of Sport will get in, will fund, will support this, will try to get more people playing laser tag and racing drones, because you can see just how much of the fighting that is through urban areas here, this grinding fighting, building to building, up and down stairwells in apartment blocks, that type of thing, which is exactly what laser tag teaches you. And the real game changer of this battle, which has been the use of drones, and particularly the FPV drones. These ones which are small devices which an explosive can be attached to. They can be flown over relatively short ranges, 10s to 20 kilometers, but can be guided in by a single soldier in a safe location well out of the range of the fighting, and using a very relatively cheap drone can take out a multi-million-dollar tank, or perhaps even more expensive and more important, a air defense radar or missile unit. So putting all of this together, there are reports coming out now, talk that some sort of a break point or an end or an inflection point will be coming soon. There's talk even from Zaluzhin in Ukraine that the offensive isn't working, that there are shell shortages. There are reports that by the end of August or September, the Ukrainians may have reached a point where they just don't have shells to be able to attack offensively. And Zaluzhin has indicated they may need to then, people suggest, turtle up. They may need to stay where they are or retreat from where they are to more established defensive lines and assume a defensive position then. So we've got that. We've also got that in October, the rains come in Ukraine. And so from mid-October, it becomes far more difficult to fight. The ability to move heavy equipment through the flat farmlands of Ukraine becomes very difficult as those roadways turn just to knee-deep, waist-deep mud. So the offensive tends to bog down there. Now, in that case, the Russians are still capable of flying drones, and they seem to have an excess of those. There was the developer of the Lancet drone has indicated that they have got 200,000 of them on the shelves ready to go. They've got a new evolution of it, the product 53, and it is supposed to be introducing its swarming capabilities, which will allow one Lancet to identify targets and then call to other Lancets, and they'll go and attack as a group. So while the rains may come and the big heavy tank battles may stop, the Russians, who don't appear to have a shortage of shells, who don't appear to have a shortage of missiles, and don't appear to have a shortage of drones or aircraft, in all of these areas, the Ukrainians are appearing to be lacking, certainly in shells. Their aircraft are having a very tough time. I've read reports that the number is 25 that have been lost since the June offensive started, 25 aircraft. I don't think the Russians have lost any of their jets in that period of time. aircraft the Ukrainians just don't have like the Russians do. Drones, it appears the Russians have the upper hand. Artillery, missiles. So in October, what may happen then is the Ukrainians retreat to a defensive position, but still they are attacked from the air by the Russians. The infrastructure is attacked. Their ammunition dumps are attacked. So that by the time we get through to December, this is when allegedly Joe Biden has said to Zelensky that if the West don't see results by December, that the amount of aid coming from the West will begin to decline. And this is it will be cut off. It's already declining as we see the Americans are shipping over cluster munitions because they can't provide 155 millimeters. The Germans are declining, reducing what they can provide, providing 1,035 shells in the latest aid package. But in December, the word is that it will start to just dry right up. So two things, I guess, here. Either US admits defeat and says, yep, we either stop or we stop for now, we go away for 5 years, we build our strength, we have another crack at Russia then, but we effectively lose this one. Sorry, Ukraine, you got chewed up. Or NATO gets involved. I don't know which one it's going to be. Part of me feels as though, I wish it would be that the US would recognize they're not winning here and would give up, and there might be some hope of Ukraine saving any more of its men from being killed and any more damage to its country. And it will obviously lose large swathes of its land to Russia, but that's the opportunity sailed when Zelensky failed to sign the negotiation agreement in March of 2022 with Russia, which would have effectively retained Ukraine's borders apart from the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, who are happy to separate, and that's been going on for 10 years. But they wouldn't have lost all of these lives, and they would still have their autonomy. But that opportunity, that ship has sailed. So I would hope that would occur. But if it doesn't, if the neocons in the West can't accept that, and if they wish to drive Europe into a war with Russia, then it's very, very easy for something like that to begin. It only takes for for Poland to step over the line and step into Belarus, something like that. Someone then fires a shell at a Polish troop and it goes over the border, and that's it. They can call an Article 5, and suddenly we do have all of Europe involved in a conflict with Russia. Look, let's hope that's not what we're talking about in December. All right, thank you. That's enough for tonight. If you've watched this far, thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed the channel and the show. Please subscribe if you haven't already subscribed, or give a like to the channel, and paste some comments. I try to reply to the comments when I can. Thank you.